On December 27, 1892, Livingstone and Biddle College, now known as Johnson C. Smith University, played in Salisbury, North Carolina, with Biddle winning 5-0. Over time, HBCU football has evolved. HBCU football's popularity continues to rise. Millions attend games each year and millions more watch on television. The HBCU bands provide some of the top entertainment in the country. Over that time, some of the best players to ever play in the National Football League played at HBCUs. Every Monday through Friday on the HBCU Football Daily Podcast, national radio and television host Donal Ware takes a look at what's happening in HBCU football and talks with coaches, players, administrators, and media about the season. Make sure you join the conversation on social media. Now, here's your host, Donal Ware.
This is the HBCU Football Daily Podcast for today, Monday, August 31st. I'm Donal Ware. Hope you had an absolutely wonderful weekend. I tell you what, some camps have opened, but camps open, the majority of the camps open beginning this week. You have several, as a matter of fact, that open today. The start of the HBCU football season is on August the 26th. So if the 31st is today, that means we're 27 days away from the start of the HBCU football season, less than 4 weeks away from the start of the HBCU football season. And we've got you covered when it comes to talking about HBCU football Monday through Friday here on the HBCU Football Daily Podcast. I want to talk about the CIAA today and expectations for the CIAA. And I think to talk about 2023, you have to go back to 2022 in the season that happened on last year. Number one, Shawan ended up winning the CIAA's Northern Division. Now, this has been a Northern Division where it's been a battle for the last several years. Clearly been, I'd say, for the last 6 or 7 years, clearly, and more than that, really, but clearly the most competitive of the two divisions, and you can decipher that because of this. You've had division win, like Bowie State. Okay, Bowie State's won it for several years up until last year. Bowie State had won it for several years in a row, but even it was a year when Virginia State ended up winning it and ultimately won the CIAA championship. You've had the battles, Bowie State, Virginia Union not quite able to get over the hump. As a matter of fact, Virginia Union hadn't won the title despite several opportunities laying right before it. But what the Panthers were, they had a couple of 8-2 seasons, but what the Panthers were able to do on last year with the 8-2 season was make it to the Division II playoffs. But if I look in the South, the last 5 years, it's been all about Fayetteville State. Fayetteville State has been in the CIAA championship game the last 5 years. Now, it's had some competition from Shaw, not so much last year. You look at Fayetteville State, and the Broncos really ran away with the division on last year. A 7-1 conference record. Shaw was next at 4-4. I think a lot of what happened to Shaw on last year was because of injuries, and we're going to talk more about that. Fayetteville State, the defending champs. We fast forward now to the present in 2023. Let's go back a couple of weeks ago when Fayetteville State was picked to win the division. So the Broncos have been picked to win the division, or not just the division, but to preseason favorites to be CIAA champions overall, and rightfully so. The Broncos lose quite a few players, but the Broncos return a quarterback that at least has some experience. And what we've seen from the Broncos in the previous 7 seasons with Richard Hayes as the head football coach, you've seen from the Broncos that offensively, the Broncos are there. They're going to get it done. The Broncos had some struggles defensively, but last year it was the defense that really came through, and you could see the makings of that going back to the 2021 season when the defense was very, very solid. As a matter of fact, off that defensive team, Joshua Williams was drafted in the 4th round by the Kansas City Chiefs, saw some significant playing time last year as the Chiefs went on to win the Super Bowl. So you see the makings of that Fayetteville State defense kind of coming to fruition. This is where, a couple of things. When I look at the preseason predicted order of finish, and like most coaches say, and it's, coaches will tell you, about the polls, that they don't really buy into the polls and all those kind of things. And I think that's not true all the way in this respect. I think sometimes coaches use the polls as motivation, particularly if they are being disrespected. Okay, I think the coaches definitely can use that as motivations, and I think motivation. And I think sometimes some of the coaches do look at those things. Now, some may not place as much emphasis on it, but again, if you've been disrespected or not picked in a certain place, you can look at it. Now, a coach like Richard Hayes may say, well, we're not really concerned about the polls. Being number one, you don't want your team to get some kind of complacency. But I bring that up because of this. I looked at the preseason predicted order of finish, and I see Bowie State is number 2, okay, over Virginia Union, which I think, I'm not really sure what's happening, why that pick was made. Bowie State, now, of course, you have the transfer portal, you've got guys that can come in and fill in the program, but they lose DJ Golub, the quarterback, who was the offensive player of the year in the CIAA last year. So you lose your trigger man. Yes, got some good pieces coming back, no doubt, on defense. Although you lose a Joshua Pryor, that's a huge, huge loss on your defensive line. But it's no doubt, when I look at Bowie State, Bowie State definitely has some players coming back. Keyshawn Hinckley, the wide receiver, comes back. But again, who's going to throw the football to him? That is definitely a question mark. And then in the secondary, Jadon Carter comes back for Bowie State. But, the coverage not bare, but I think Bowie State loses a lot. But when I look at Virginia Union, and I see a guy like Jada Byers coming back, the running back, was HBCU All-American last year. The young man rushed, is either over, I think it was over for over 1,500 yards. He's one of the best. He was a top 5 rusher in Division II, and he's, the number, and I don't have the numbers in front of me, but the number of rushing touchdowns that he had, that's going to open up things for Virginia Union from an offensive perspective. All right, from the quarterback perspective, it's definitely going to be able to open some things up for Virginia Union as well. So I'm not really sure what was happening there. So that means if you're talking about Bowie State overall as the number 3 pick and Bowie State at number 2, what it means is in the division, the Northern Division, the pick is Bowie State number 1 and Virginia Union number 2. And I thought that was very interesting. I think Union wins the conference. Now, maybe some of that is because you look at Union over time, and listen, Union hasn't won a Northern Division crown. It's been a good little while since Virginia Union has been to the CIAA championship game. So maybe that was taken into consideration there. Okay. You've got Shaw at number 4. And I like this pick. I think when I look at the Bears last year, I think a lot of what happened with the Bears was from a perspective of injuries. The Bears had a lot of injuries last year. This was a Shaw team that I really thought was going to challenge and maybe even overtake Fayetteville State for the Southern Division crown. Now, that's not to say that Shaw didn't have some other issues other than injuries. Adrian Jones, the head coach there, be the first to tell you he's going into the 7th season. He'll be the first to tell you that. But I think this year the Bears are going to be healthy. They understand their quarterback situation, but they've got one of the best running backs in the CIAA coming back in Sidney Gibbs. He didn't have as great a season as maybe he had going back to the 2021 season when he was first team all CIAA, but nonetheless, he had a really, really good season. You got a guy like that on your team. I think that's going to bode well for Shaw. When I look at the rest of the division, Johnson C. Smith is third. I mean, when I look at the Golden Bulls, they've got to make sure that the trigger man is in the right situation. But they've got a kid, Brevin Caldwell, a wide receiver who is really, really good. Maurice Flowers is an excellent offensive mind. So I think, Johnson C. Smith is going to figure it out from that perspective. But I still think in the Southern Division, it's Fayetteville State and Shaw. Okay. Now in the Northern Division, right? I mean, to me, it's Virginia Union. But I mean, Virginia State, Henry Frazier, in his first year at Virginia State. I mean, I think he had a really, really good season. I think Virginia State can challenge. Now, let's look at this. Okay. Let's remember a couple of things. Bluefield State comes into the conference. So you lose Shawan, but Bluefield State comes into the conference. I think that's good. I think Bluefield State is gonna bring some competition immediately to the CIAA. You look at what Bluefield State did last year. Bluefield State went 4-4 last year, but even as important in a year where it's first year of its football program. But even more so, beat a couple of CIAA opponents. So I thought that was really big for Bluefield State. They're not going to come in. I don't think they're going to come in and challenge for the Northern Division, but I think that's big. But here's what I look at as a sleeper team. I think Lincoln. I think Coach Dean, Josh Dean, has got that team on the right trajectory. Because if I've looked at Lincoln over many, many years, and when I think back to like 2010, 2011, Lincoln had some decent teams. Like we're talking about teams that, would be 4-6, 5-5. That hasn't been the case recently. Lincoln, if I can remember, has lost all of its games in a course of a season more recently. May have won one game, may have won a couple of games during the course of a season. But Lincoln's got a trigger man in Isaiah Freeman. Watch out for Isaiah Freeman. The quarterback had a solid true freshman year. Last year put up some decent numbers. I expect him to be even better in 2023. And while I don't think Lincoln's going to be in the upper echelon of the conference as a whole, to say that Lincoln, who's been picked to finish last in the division, by the way, in 10th overall in the CIAA, could be a top 3 team, meaning really third. I don't think that's out of the realm of possibility for the Lions this season. I think another team that's going to be improved is Livingstone. I think Sean Gilbert, in his 3rd season now as the head coach there, to me, the Blue Bears took a big step last year. Big step last year. You're talking about a team that won a couple of games in 1 game in 2021 to a team that won 4 games last year. So I think that's a big step. They lose some pieces now. Don't get me wrong. They like the defensive back. And matter of fact, I do have it in front of me. The defensive back, and I'm going to get that information for you right now. Well, I thought I was going to get that information, but they lose a kid that was really big last year. Had a bunch of interceptions. His name is escaping me right now. It doesn't come back. If you go back, and I'll have to go back and listen to our countdown to kickoff from a couple of weeks ago, Sean Gilbert mentioned that this young man wasn't returning in the secondary. I think that's big, but I think from an offensive perspective, the Blue Bears should be pretty good this year. And they're going to be pretty good on the defensive side of the football as well. So, you've got a CIAA that's continuing to improve. I think the key, if Shaw is able to compete, they're going to have to stay, the Bears are going to have to stay healthy the first 4 games of the season, because it's brutal. You open against the defending Division II HBCU national champs in Benedict, and Benedict's going to be very, very good. As a matter of fact, Shaw has to go to Benedict this year. I think that's going to, for the opening game of the season, that's going to be tough. Then comes back home to host Virginia Union, who I think is going to win the Northern Division. And then the next 2 games are on the road, even at Bowie State. That's going to be tough. And then at Elizabeth City State, who's going to be improved this year. So you're talking about your 3 of your first 4 games away from home. But fortunately, those are they're non-conference, if you will. Even though the Bowie State and Elizabeth City State are conference games, they're non-division games. So those first 4 games, if you're the Bears, you want to be competitive. It's not the end of the world if they maybe say start 1-3. It's not the end of the world, but you want to at least be competitive in those games, be healthy, and then get ready, for that home stretch. Maybe even the first 5 games, because you got Virginia State, although as the 5th game, although Virginia State is a game that is at home. So the Bears are going to be at home after that for the next 3 weeks. The first game against Virginia State, then division opponents in Johnson C. Smith and Winston. So while the first part of the season, the first 4 games, 3 of the first 4 games are away from home, the next 3 are at home. So really, you're talking about for the first 7 games for the Bears, at home. And it could be an opportunity for the Bears to by the time you get through that 7th game, be in position, because on October 21st at Livingstone and then at home on October 28th, the next to last game of the season, which the last game of the season is against their rival, St. Augustine's, who, of course, St. Augustine's and Shaw separated by 1.8 miles. But if you're the Bears, get to that point, be in position to take on the Fayetteville State Broncos, the defending champs. And I do believe that the Southern Division this year is going to come down to the matchup between Fayetteville State and the Shaw Bears. That's a look at the CIAA this year, and giving you my thoughts. This week on the HBCU Football Daily Podcast, we're going to take a look at the CIAA, more specifically Hampton and North Carolina A&T. We're going to take a look at the SIAC, and then I'm going to have a couple of replays of some conversations that I had with a few of the coaches at MEAC Media Day going back to a couple of weeks ago. Don't forget to tell a couple of friends about the HBCU Football Daily Podcast. Also let them know to subscribe to the Box to Row channel and on the HBCU Football Daily Podcast. You can find us on YouTube, on the Box to Row YouTube channel, as well as on BOXTOROW.com and iHeartMedia.com, where you can download and listen to the podcast. Talk with you tomorrow.
We hope you enjoyed this episode of the HBCU Football Daily Podcast. You can also listen to the podcast at BOXTOROW.com, iHeartMedia, or wherever you get your podcasts. Don't forget to get your HBCU football fix on Box to Row with Donal Ware each weekend on the radio station near you, and on SiriusXM on HBCU, Channel 142, and on ESPNU Radio on SiriusXM, Channel 84. Follow us on Twitter and Instagram at Box to Row for the latest in HBCU football, and don't forget to tell a friend.